Hello everyone, this is Blasphemous. It's a Metroidvania with some action RPG thrown in there, set in a very, very grim setting that's, it seems to me to be sort of reminiscent or influenced by like a fantasy version of Spanish Catholicism, I believe, like sort of Inquisition era stuff, which is why everyone is wearing pointy hats. And it's kind of been talked about here and there as being, you know, a bit Dark Soulsy, a bit Hollow Knighty and things like that. But what is it really? Well, it's, I would say Hollow Knight is actually probably one of the better comparisons, even though it is not nearly as, like, sort of finely polished as Hollow Knight is to, like, a mirror shine, because its gameplay is very different from that, but it is in a similar feel, you know, in a Metroidvania where you have a single weapon. It's not in, like, the Salt and Sanctuary / Dark Souls / all of that kind of tradition of having lots of gear that enemies will drop and you can equip and, like, upgrade in crafting systems and stuff like that. There's none of that here. You get a single weapon, you don't change armor or anything like that, but there is still quite a lot of customization in terms of how you will play, in the same vein as something like Hollow Knight with its pins, and you have various ways of actually doing that, like for instance, you know, finding, of course, various upgrades for your health and your fervor, that blue meter, which is used for things, finding new prayers, which are basically like spells. These are what use fervor for the most part. Finding hearts for your sword, which will change how it works in some way and often come with a negative as well as a positive. Prayer beads, which are like your main sort of passive increases to various things. They have a lot of different effects, and you can equip increasing numbers of them as you go through the game and find ways to expand the amount you can actually have at once. And other stuff like relics, which when you think of a Metroidvania, you often think of things that allow you to backtrack, go back to areas that you couldn't get to before, you know, the sort of like a double jump, or the ability to make a platform, or the ability to pass the red door, all those various like Metroidvania things. That's mostly what relics do. They allow you to get to areas that you couldn't previously by giving you something, everything from solidified blood platforms floating in the air to these roots that go across the screen that you can use as platforms and the like, and climbable walls. Now, as I mentioned, the game has a very dark, very grim setting. It's a lot of like Gothic architecture and things, and also a very sort of fantasy Catholicism sort of theme, with a sort of worldwide religion that has some very odd ideas about how to go about life, and involves a lot of like penance and the idea that like suffering is inevitable and almost required for you to actually achieve purity and things like that. Very much stuff that is in like the sort of like Inquisition era Catholicism and other stuff like that, that sort of thing. It's actually, the way that the setting is reminds me a lot of Warhammer 40,000. Not necessarily because it's extremely similar to that setting, but because it's like steeped in its own atmosphere to the point of like almost parody, but not quite. Like, you know, even very simple things have a sort of thematic bend to them. Like, for instance, when you die, it doesn't say you died, it says exemplaris excommunicationis or something along those lines, which I believe is sort of Spanish from Latin, meaning something along the lines of, like, you have been made an example of, effectively, like your excommunication through death has been made an example of by the church because you failed. That's sort of the idea. It's pretty rough, actually. And when you kill a boss, it says requiem aeternum, which is Latin for basically like rest forever, eternal rest, that sort of thing. So yeah, it's just every bit of its theme, it's kind of like soaked in it throughout the whole game, and almost everything has this this sort of grim religious bend to it, which is kind of interesting actually, because again, it reminds me of 40K and other universes like that use their theme, their setting, as a sort of like launching point to make everything have its own sort of weird, grim version of itself. It's actually kind of fascinating when every aspect of a setting seems to kind of like drip its own theme. It lays it on so thick, but I actually kind of like it. It's neat. And that definitely extends to other elements of the game, like its music, which is very good. In fact, you can buy the soundtrack on its own, which is a good idea because it's got some pretty great music. And of course, as you can probably tell in the background, the aesthetic of the game is, well, dark, kind of weird. There's all sorts of really strange things that you'll come across, things that you'll actually have to fight, like this boss in the background, for instance, and other things that are just stuff that happens that you kind of set you back a little bit, like, what was that? Is that like a gold-faced baby emerging from a slice-in-half calf? And yes, it actually was. So there's a lot of symbolism and a lot of other things. You don't really have to, you know like Catholic symbolism or anything to actually get anything out of the game. It's not Catholicism, it's a fantasy version of it. So it's stuff that you kind of learn going through, and it does do the whole Dark Souls thing of having a lot of lore in the item descriptions, but in this case there is actually a specific lore entry for every item. So the items themselves will have some sort of like small bit of lore as well as what they do in their actual description, but then there is a lore button that you can press that will go to sometimes like an entire paragraph or more of like very well written lore. The game itself has, I mean, I guess it fits for how sort of complex and interesting the theming and symbolism is. It has a lot of lore, a lot of stuff to learn, and a lot of very odd things about it that are pretty fascinating, actually. They have clearly put a lot of thought and a lot of effort into the setting to actually make it honestly kind of uncomfortable and grim and like all-encompassing, and that's pretty neat, actually. The combat starts off quite simple, but does get some complexity later on. It's another thing that reminds me of Hollow Knight more than other games like Dark Souls and Salt and Sanctuary and stuff like that, because the combat has a single weapon with only a certain number of moves, but these moves will be expanded on as you go, and a lot of the complexity in the combat is how to use these moves across the various monsters that you'll be facing. So again, very much like Hollow Knight, a lot of the complexity of the combat doesn't come from the fact that the combat has a lot of intricate moving parts to it, but because of what you're interacting with in terms of the various enemies and bosses and things, making it more interesting and complicated as a result of having to be able to deal with them properly. And this game does do that very well, although I will say, as far as the combat goes, the boss fights have been a little disappointing difficulty-wise. I mean, as you can tell in the background, there's still a lot going on, and some of them are really fascinating looking. They have really, really good visual designs that are super great, but in terms of the actual difficulty of the boss fight, they're actually not that hard for the most part. I haven't encountered very many bosses that I've had all that much trouble with. I mean, this boss, for instance, this was my first try ever actually fighting her, and I managed to beat her fairly decisively. And that has kind of been the case with most of the bosses. Only 2 of them so far have given me any real trouble. One of them was just because it was quite early in the game and I was sort of wrestling with the controls, because the boss involves a lot of ledge grabs and wall climbing and stuff, and I hadn't quite gotten that down yet. The boss itself almost never hurt me, but I did fall to my death repeatedly because of the way that it's one of those screen-scrolling vertical boss fights where you have to keep climbing or else you'll die. That sort of thing. And the other one is actually just a genuinely difficult, really good boss fight in the form of a character and his sister that fight you, and they combine their efforts to become really quite difficult. Actually, there's a lot of attacks to memorize, and it's a lot of fun. It's my favorite boss fight that I've encountered so far, and it took me a good, like, 3 or 4 tries, probably 4, to actually pass it, because especially when you get later in the boss and you have to face both of them at once with all these lightning strikes and other things going on, it actually gets pretty hectic, and it's a lot of fun. But I would say that so far, that particular boss fight has been the exception rather than the rule, and most of them have had fairly simple patterns to memorize. They haven't really had a great number of attacks or anything like that, so once you get the pattern down, you can really hammer down on them pretty hard, and the boss will go down pretty quick. And for boss fights that do have multiple phases, I often find that the phases don't really change all that much. Like, they get tougher, and they may have like 1 or 2 extra things added to them, but that's about it. Very few bosses so far have had a second or a third phase that have really changed them up a lot and made you like really have to learn the new mechanics or anything. It's just kind of like a slight extension of the previous mechanics. So I would say that the boss fights are good. I haven't found one that I thought was bad at all. It's just they're easier than I would expect in a game like this. And I often find that there are some normal enemies that are actually more difficult than the bosses themselves, because although they don't take nearly as long to kill, some of the regular enemies have some fairly difficult to dodge attacks, especially when there's like a screen full of them and a couple other things trying to kill you all at once. So yeah, the difficulty in the game is a little bit all over the place. I would say it is a tough game. I wouldn't say that it's like crushingly difficult, but it is higher than your average difficulty of games like this. It's difficult, it's noticeably tough, but it is very manageable, and it's definitely been fun all the way through, despite a couple of hiccups of some kind of weird, frustrating mechanics here and there. Like I mentioned, the boss fight with a scrolling upward screen, that was just sort of frustrating. There wasn't anything difficult about it. It was just the ledge grab in this game. I should mention, this game has a ledge grab, which is cool because that allows the jumps to feel a little less cheap, where you can actually, grab ledges that are within your reach. It's a nice thing to have. But sometimes it works a little too well, and sometimes it can be difficult to walk off of a ledge without grabbing it. I'm sure you've played a lot of games like this where there are platforms below the one you're on, but you can't fall through the one you're on, so you have to jump off of it and then double back towards where you jumped from in order to get below yourself to get some sort of item or collectible or something. And there are several moments like that in this game that I've encountered so far, but it's actually difficult to, as you saw right there, sometimes to double back without just grabbing onto the ledge, and you have to make it artificially more difficult than it should be because you have to wait in the air longer before you can double back on it on yourself without grabbing it. So it's a good system, and I think it's better to be like a magnetized ledge that your character grabs onto more easily than something that's really finicky and annoying. It's better to have it this way, but it still has its own issues occasionally. And also there are some ledges that you cannot grab onto, and you don't necessarily know which ones those are until you find them, probably while falling to your death. So that's something to consider. But still, it's a good system that for the most part works, but it has its own problems occasionally. There are tons and tons of enemies to face, as you can probably tell. There are loads of them. Those guys in particular are really annoying because they always get one extra attack even after they're technically dead. They will only do their death animation after they land from their attack, which is a little cheap, but that's okay. Most of the enemies are actually pretty fun to fight, and there is a pretty robust parrying system that the game has from the very beginning. You have sort of a block, but it really is just a parry because you can't hold it to continuously block attacks. You have to time it correctly to actually parry them, which is cool, and I definitely enjoy that sort of thing, and a lot of the enemy attacks are parryable. And even the ones that you can't parry exactly, you can still block with this as long as you time it right, but it just sends you flying backwards a little bit, but it still negates the damage, so it's still a valuable thing to do, a really nice thing to be able to use. And if you're actually able to block an attack at the right time and then attack with the right timing and hit the attack button like as soon as your first attack lands, they'll get stunned, and you can actually perform an execution attack on them, which will give you more fervor, the blue resource that you use for your ranged attack and for casting prayers. And they're pretty grisly. A lot of these are really well animated and very gruesome. Like, people get ripped apart, basically. They're extremely grisly, but they're actually kind of fun, and when you're coming across an enemy that's annoyed the crap out of you, it is pretty satisfying to like rip them into pieces and get a nice little bit of fervor for it. So the combat is robust. It is not extremely varied, but it does a good job. And it also does a good job of not getting in the way, if that makes sense, of not being clunky and obnoxious for certain enemies or anything like that. It's a good combat system that flows well, has a good amount of weight and impact to it, and because of the variety in prayers and extra sword abilities that you can obtain, like combo finishers and range attacks and things, it does have some variety to it. It does have bits to actually explore as you go through the game. It does get better as you go, so it's not like you start with all of the attacks that you'll ever have. You can, in fact, there is character progression despite there not being like levels or gear or anything like that. There still exists. Something else that's actually kind of interesting by its absence is in a lot of Metroidvania games you come across these teleporter rooms that you can teleport to various areas for, so that when you need to backtrack and things like that, once you've gained the ability to pass the red door, you can find the previous areas a little quicker because you can teleport to each of them. Well, this game does have those teleporter rooms, but as far as I know, there are only like 4 of them. So you're going to be doing a lot of walking. Now, this game actually does go the what is often considered the Dark Souls route of having a ton of shortcuts. So instead of having a lot of fast travel, there are a lot of lifts and ladders and levers and other things like that that will unlock ways back to where you previously were quicker than you actually came. So even though you're not going to be teleporting a lot, you do unlock lots of little shortcuts and things like that to actually go through the areas. And that's actually kind of one thing that this game really, I would say, does best is its secrets. This game has a ton of secrets. If you like to play Metroidvanias because they often reward exploration, well, this is the game for you. There are a ton of secrets. You will be like attacking every wall and ground pounding every bit of ground and just going to every edge of every screen that you can to find new stuff. And the game often does, in fact, reward you with new stuff if you do these things. There are just tons of things to find, from new relics that allow you to traverse areas you couldn't previously to find even more secrets, to like collectible bones to unlock future content later. I'm not entirely sure what they do, but they do seem to be building up to something. And sword hearts, things like that to make yourself more powerful. So there's a lot of rewarding exploration going on here, and in fact, some of the stuff that you have to do to actually get new things is actually really obscure and really interesting. So let me just outline one of them for you. There's a relic that allows you, as I mentioned, to grow these viney root-like things to actually access new areas. The process to get this relic is really quite the thing because it takes a long time. You will, at one point, pretty far away from most other parts of the world, find this sort of cocoon-like egg of hair, and if you follow some of the lore descriptions of the items in the area, you'll actually sort of have an idea what's in it, unfortunately. And there will be 3 offering plates before this egg, and it's clear that you can put something on them. Now, it doesn't tell you what to actually put on them, but it's obvious that you can offer something. And eventually you will find these 3 items, and although the items do not say to go there in the description and put them on those plates, one thing I do like that this game does is the lore entries all tell different parts of the same story, which lets you know that they're part of a set of items. So it doesn't tell you what to do with them, but if you just read the lore, you can make it pretty obvious that they belong together. You know, if you wherever you use one, you're going to use the others. You will get these 3 items, put them on this offering plate, and something will happen that I won't spoil, and you will get an egg. You then must go to a different area in a completely different part of the world that you can offer the egg to, leave the screen, come back, the egg will be hatched, then take the egg to a big statue in a fountain, don't ask, and he will bless it, and it will become the actual equipable relic egg. That's just one of these things. There are all sorts of things like this that you will come across, and a lot of them have some pretty obscure ways to obtain them and or to actually make them into usable items, because just because you found something in this game does not mean you can actually use it yet. You can find new flasks for yourself. They are the healing flasks, very much like an Estus flask. You know, you use them up and you go back to a what's sort of like a shrine to replenish them, and also it respawns all the enemies, so it's basically a bond shrine. And at these shrines, you will notice that you actually cannot refill the empty ones that you found to give yourself more of a maximum number of them. You actually must find these other things in the world, these sort of blood altars, blood fountains, I suppose, that allow you to pay to refill the empty flasks, and then you can add them to your new maximum total. So you actually have to find a collectible and then find a place to use the collectible, and then pay for the process. There's a lot of stuff like that in this game, and at first I wasn't sure if I liked it or not in terms of like how obscure finding and using some of the stuff actually was, but I really started to get into it, and I really started to like the fact that just because you found something doesn't necessarily mean you can use it immediately, and there's often some sort of greater story there, and if you actually read the lore and stuff like that, you actually can obtain ideas of what to do with them, and it's sort of fascinating that there's just so much of that in this game. So if you like secrets, this is the game for you, because it's basically made of them. Overall, I'd say it's actually a pretty fantastic game. It's quite large, it's got lots of places to go, there are a ton of locations, and a pretty large number of bosses and a large number of enemies as well. If you are okay with the combat being simple but not too simple, and some of the boss fights being a little bit disappointing in the difficulty department, while also being really like fantastically well designed visually, this is actually a really pretty great game. It's available for $25 on Steam, and I would suggest giving it a shot if you enjoy Metroidvanias, action RPGs, that sort of thing, because it's a pretty unique version of this sort of genre, and it's done really well. It's probably one of the better examples I've seen of really rewarding exploration. It does genuinely do a very good job of actually giving the player a lot to find and a lot to do, and pretty much every seemingly dead end that you'll find probably has some sort of secret to it that you may or may not ever actually come across. So yeah, it's a pretty great game that does have some small problems here and there, but does actually come out the end being its own pretty unique creature, actually, and it's definitely worth experiencing, especially because of its really crazy aesthetic and weird boss design and stuff. It's got some pretty fascinating story elements to it. So yeah, that has been Blasphemous, available in the description, as always, below this video. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.